Hello and welcome to another very entertaining video. Today's goal is to introduce you to the concept of endocrine signaling and show you some of the more basic but fundamental elaborate endocrine signaling mechanisms that your body uses to maintain homeostasis. But before we dive into endocrine signaling, we first have to take a step back and make sure we can identify and define what a hormone is. And so I've got this definition up here. Any member of a class of signaling molecules produced by glands in multicellular organisms that are transported by the circulatory system to target distant organs to regulate physiology and behavior. It then gives some examples. We've got steroids and then amino acid and protein derivatives. So there's a couple of things that I want to make mention of. First of all, this statement right here. These signaling molecules are transported by the circulatory system. In other words, if a hormone's in the blood going to everywhere in the body, this is endocrine signaling. And second, as we look at types or classes of hormones, something that's striking is that there's no sugar. We got fats in the form of steroids, and we've got amino acid and protein derivatives, but there are no carbohydrate hormones. Another thing that I want to point out, this idea of a tropic hormone. And in the broadest sense, this is a hormone that regulates the expression of another hormone. Where this is going to come into play really for us is with the pituitary gland that we'll discuss in a minute and how it regulates hormones or secretes hormones that will then turn out to regulate other hormones. With those broad definitions taken care of, let's take a look at the major hormone pathways that we're going to be discussing in this unit. All right, working top to bottom as we dress this stickman for success, let's start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is in the brain. It's part of the diencephalon, right in the middle of the brain. And as we've discussed previously, it has significant regulatory roles in autonomic regulation and a variety of things. What we're really focused on this time around is its regulation of the master gland. It's connected down here at the base. This is the pituitary gland. The pituitary can be subdivided into a couple of different parts, the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis. A lot of times people would just refer to these as the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary respectively. Working in the caudal direction, let's add a bow tie. And not just any bow tie, this is a polka dot bow tie. You should be familiar with these glands. We've talked about them. The main bow tie structure is the thyroid. We discussed it in the context of calcium signaling. And then the polka dots on the back end, the paired parathyroid glands. The parathyroid really does have a unique role in calcium regulation. The thyroid gland does other things besides calcium regulation, mainly the production of metabolic T3 and T4 hormones, and we'll come to that in a future video. Now entering the abdominopelvic cavities, let's add the pancreas. In our previous unit on digestion, we talked a great deal about the exocrine functions of the pancreas, how it secretes digestive enzymes, bicarb, etc., into the small intestine to help with digestion. This time around, we're going to focus on its endocrine functions, specifically on insulin and glucagon. Next, we have the paired adrenal glands. These are sitting on top of the kidneys. Let's draw some kidneys. The adrenal gland is a pyramid-shaped gland, sitting right here on top. And then lastly, as we discuss reproductive tissue, both the testes and the ovaries, located near the pelvic floor. So this gives you an idea of the glands that we're going to discuss over the next several days in much more detail, including hormone synthesis, regulation of hormone secretion, positive and negative feedback, and of course the function of these various hormones. But before we do that, let's remind ourselves again what endocrine signaling actually is and what it isn't. We've already defined what a hormone is. We've defined a tropic hormone. Let's make sure we understand the different signaling modalities that we could observe as cells communicate with each other. The first is autocrine. The easiest way to think about autocrine simply is, if this is a cell, autocrine is signaling to self. So we'll just draw an arrow pointed to self. As an example, we saw this in hemostasis as platelets released granules, and those granules came and bound on the surface of those platelets and caused the platelets to change shape, to start to aggregate, stick together. That's autocrine signaling, where a cell signals to itself to do something. The next type of signaling is paracrine. And in paracrine, we have multiple cell types. We'll draw another cell over here. This is a red cell. Paracrine is signaling to its neighbors. It doesn't matter who lives in the neighborhood. Everyone in the neighborhood is going to get the signal. The key point here is it doesn't go beyond the neighborhood. This is a localized signaling event. The next modality is exocrine. And we've already discussed in this in the context of the pancreas, where the pancreas delivered through a tube, technically to the outside of the body, of which the gut is. But anyway, this is site-specific through a tube. And then lastly, what we want to talk about, endocrine. And with endocrine, the key point is we need a blood vessel. And as hormones are secreted into the blood, this signal goes to all systems. In other words, everywhere. However, this does invite some concerns. Remember, we talked about about hormones being made of steroid lipids, sterols. These are all cholesterol derived, or built from amino acids or proteins. And with this diversity, we have to think about all of these things going through the blood. We have to think about transport. And we can divide transport of these hormones up into two fairly broad classes. One we'll call free, and the other requires a carrier. Things that can be transported free include primarily things that are water soluble. And importantly, a correlation that I want you to make is that these types of hormones tend to have a short half-life. What is the half-life? The half-life is how long these hormones are going to exist once they've been released from the gland. As an example, take epinephrine or adrenaline, right? You have that near-death experience. Maybe it was a close call with a car. Your heart's pounding, you're breathing hard, your eyes are super dilated. You obviously don't want to exist in that state for very long. Sometimes you might even have to pull over to the side of the road and just catch your breath. Epinephrine has a half-life of around 5 minutes. And so a couple of minutes into it, you're going to feel the effects of epinephrine start to wane simply because epinephrine is disappearing from the blood because it has a fairly short half-life. But let's take something that's less water-soluble, something like vitamin D. Remember, vitamin D is made from a cholesterol derivative in your skin and is therefore lipid-soluble and requires a carrier. Carriers are simply molecules, some of them proteins, in the blood that help transport hydrophobic structures. These can be nonspecific transporters like albumin, which is just sticky to everything, or it could be something very specific, a carrier specific for sex hormones, for example, testosterone, estrogen. Regardless, one of the things that the carrier does is increase the half-life. And things like vitamin D3, before it's converted to calcitriol by the kidney, can exist in your blood for up to 2 weeks, circulating, waiting for that activation signal. Now, in addition to transport, another thing that we have to consider are the receptor types that bind to these hormones. For our purposes, these can be divided up into 2 different types, either membrane-bound or intracellular receptors. Examples of membrane-bound receptors include G-protein-coupled receptors, we've discussed these previously, or receptor tyrosine kinases, whereas intracellular receptors are for lipid-soluble receptors. These types are for lipid-soluble ligands. These types of hormones can pass through the membrane by simple diffusion because they match the small, nonpolar, non-charged lipophilic qualities that allow them to go right through the cell membrane. So these tend to be steroid hormones. Also, the metabolic hormones T3 and T4. Let's just give you an idea of what these might look like. So if we're talking about membrane-bound, here's the surface of the cell. A G-protein-coupled receptor is a 7-pass transmembrane receptor associated with the activation of the alpha subunit of the G-protein, and this is what's going to trigger the signal cascade. With receptor tyrosine kinases, it's something slightly different. This requires 2 different receptors, where ligand binding, shown here in purple, recruits a second receptor to create a paired receptor. We call it dimer. And once this is in a dimer configuration, this leads to a signal cascade. But in both cases, the hormone binds to the receptor outside of the cell and triggers a signal cascade within the cell. This is in contrast to the intracellular receptors, where steroid hormones, of course these are cholesterol derivatives, so they look kind of like this, pass right through the cell. And the way I like to think about these, the intracellular receptor itself, I like to think of it as a car. And all it's lacking is a driver. Once that driver comes in and sits in it, now it's activated, and these tend to be transcription factors, leading to the transcription of genes and then the creation of proteins associated with that signal. So hopefully that gives you a broader view, if we zoom out, of what endocrine signaling is, of what hormones are, the different kind of receptors, how these hormones are transported through the blood. I'd like to finish up by going back up to our dressed up individual here and focus right now on one more idea, the core idea of the hypothalamus and the pituitary and how they regulate so much of what's going on. So if we zoom in, we might see something like this. Here's the hypothalamus, and we've got the posterior pituitary, and over here the anterior pituitary. Now, I want to make a couple of distinctions. First of all, the hypothalamus, right? This is a physical part of the brain. These are mostly neurons. And remember, the posterior pituitary we call the neurohypophysis. The best way to think about this is that the posterior pituitary is simply an extension of the hypothalamus. There are two hormones released from the posterior pituitary. You're going to be familiar with the first one, ADH, antidiuretic hormone. We saw this in the kidney. Among the signals that regulate ADH release are angiotensin II, and upon release, it goes through the blood, targets principal cells in the collecting duct of the kidney, where it causes expression and increased permeability of aquaporin channels to help reabsorb water. Another hormone is oxytocin. Oxytocin is an often underestimated hormone. It doesn't get as much attention as it should, and is typically just thought of as the hormone responsible for driving uterine contractions during labor, which it does and is super important. Also a hormone that is released upon suckling, breastfeeding of an infant with the mother. And here's where we start to get clues about what else it's involved in. Oxytocin is an anti-stress hormone. It often combats, as an anti-stress hormone, it often has opposing effects to that of cortisol and can turn bad situations into memorably good situations with the right mindset. It's induced by visual and pleasant sensory stimuli, a hug, a pat on the back. It's involved in bonding and is released during sexual intimacy as a way to pair couples in a tighter bond. Very powerful hormone. What I want you to recognize is that these are essentially neuroendocrine hormones, where the neuron releasing them, very similar to a neurotransmitter, the soma of that neuron is up here in the hypothalamus. The axon extends down into the posterior pituitary, and these hormones are released into the blood. I want to contrast that with what's going on with the anterior pituitary. There's 6 major hormones that we need to think about from the anterior side. Growth hormone, abbreviated GH, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, and two hormones involved in regulating reproduction, FSH and LH. But a key difference is these are not neuroendocrine hormones. The anterior pituitary is actually glandular in nature, rather than made of neurons. But still, the release of these hormones is under control of the hypothalamus. How does this work? Well, as the hypothalamus receives signals, input, regarding the release of these hormones, the hypothalamus releases what are called releasing hormones into a system called a portal system, in this case, the hypophyseal portal system. Now, by definition, a portal system is 2 capillary beds in series. This actually doesn't happen very often, right? You go through a capillary bed, you exchange oxygen, you pick up waste, you go back to take care of that stuff. We do see a hepatic portal system, right, where we're absorbing food and then we're delivering it to the liver. That requires 2 capillary beds in series. And the hypophyseal system is very, very similar, right? Where we've got 1 capillary bed where we're going to pick up these releasing hormones. And in the next capillary bed, these releasing hormones can exit and target the glandular tissue in the anterior pituitary. In response, the anterior pituitary releases whatever hormone it was signaled to release, and these can enter the portal system. And now we're off to the rest of the body. So hopefully that gives you a general idea of how the hypothalamus and the posterior and anterior pituitaries work, and the portal system that allows them to work. And then we'll go into detail with each of these in future videos discussing the role of these hormones in regulating body function.